My name is Todd Hull, and I am an Associate Professor of English at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, South Korea. In today's presentation, I want to talk about dictation, specifically dictation for adult foreign language learners, and more specifically than that, adult foreign language university learners. What does dictation do? Dictation, it actually is good for language. It helps students learn. Dictation is actually good for students. But traditional dictation was just boring. It didn't engage learners. So even though it was good for learners, it was like medicine that didn't taste good. And also, it didn't actually involve real world communication. But Ruth Regenrib formulated what she called dictogloss, and this was a dictation method that actually incorporated the communicative approach and brought dictation into the communicative era of teaching foreign languages. So it actually is pedagogically sound because it helps language acquisition and students engage in authentic communication. The one thing is that a lot of the topics that she and successive practitioners of dictogloss used are a little bit more at home in a language institute than an academic university setting. No problems there, but I want to talk about some of the topics that might be used at universities rather than language institutes. So in this presentation, I'll summarize some traditional types of dictation first. Then we'll go through what dictogloss is and how it's better than traditional dictation. I'll give some of the research on the benefits, and I'll suggest how it can be used at the university level. So traditional dictation. Scott Al-Khoury talks about 4 types. The first type he calls phonemic item dictation. So here teachers just read out individual sounds that are often hard for students. Things like L and R, B and V, P and F, these types of things. This is classic minimal pairs, and it helps students distinguish between sounds that may be difficult for them. Next, there's phonemic text dictation. So here, students actually listen to a text and they transcribe it phonemically or phonetically. And this is great because it helps learners separate sounds from spellings. The only difficulty here is that students do have to learn a phonemic or phonetic transcription system first, but it is useful for students. Next is what he calls orthographic item dictation. So this is the classic spelling test. So it's basically just a spelling test. A teacher reads out words and students spell them. Again, this is useful. Dictation is useful, and Al-Khoury says that it is, quote, useful for reinforcing the correlation between the spelling system and sound system of a language. Next, there is orthographic text dictation. And this is where students hear a whole passage, and of course this is the classic dictation. When people think of dictations or remember dictations they have done, this is what they are usually thinking about. And what Al-Khoury says about this is that, quote, besides reinforcing the spelling sound correlations of English, the orthographic text dictation uncovers comprehension and grammatical weaknesses in learners which the teacher can analyze and address in future lessons. So, dictation helps. Dictation actually does further language acquisition and improve proficiency in a foreign language. Finocchiaro, all the way back in 1969, summarized some of the benefits of it, and his summary is still relevant these days. So, first of all, he says that dictation ensures attentive listening. So, learners have to focus. They really have to focus on their listening. And it trains pupils to distinguish sounds. So, again, different sounds like L and R, B and V, etc. Also, it helps them with their punctuation. And again, it enables pupils to transfer oral sounds to written symbols. So again, listening to writing. And again, another thing it does is it develops their listening comprehension, their oral comprehension. And finally, it helps students evaluate themselves. Where do they need to improve? What might they do to improve their language skills in the future? As I mentioned before, traditional dictation is just plain boring. Also, as I mentioned before, it really does help language acquisition, but in traditional dictation, there was no communication going on. There was no real-world communications. It was just listen and write. So, Rip developed Dictogloss to address that. So, what is Dictogloss, this communicative dictation method? Classic Dictogloss activity has 4 stages. First, preparation. Here, learners actually learn about the topic and maybe some of the vocabulary that will be used in the text. Then there's the actual dictation, where learners hear the listening text and they take some notes on it. Next, what is different than a traditional dictation is that instead of just listening and listening and listening and listening until the teacher goes around and checks to make sure everybody has it right, learners listen, but then they just try to reconstruct the text after listening to the text a couple of times. They try to reconstruct it on their own. And then, after that, learners actually analyze the text that they have reconstructed and correct some of the errors. So, as I mentioned before, Dictogloss adds a communicative element. How does it do that? Again, as mentioned before, what happens is the text is read twice at normal speed. Then learners take notes. Then learners reconstruct their text. I mentioned that learners reconstruct their text, but what makes Dictogloss especially communicative is they don't just do that on their own. They actually work together with other learners in class to reconstruct their texts. And then each group of students produces their own reconstructed version, coming as close as they can to the original. But their goal is not to get it quote-unquote right, to exactly reconstruct the original text. Their goal is to come close and get the main idea. Then all the groups can come together and they can refine their text and get it as close to the original as possible. So, what's the main difference between Dictogloss and traditional dictation? Well, first of all, Dictogloss is communicative. There is genuine communication when students are doing a Dictogloss activity. In fact, Dictogloss activities cannot be completed unless learners actually succeed in communicating their ideas, succeed in real-world communication. Selects are good, they're for adults, but they often have the feel of belonging a little more at a language institute than a university. So I just want to go through and give some examples of some topics, and we can get an idea, we can get a feel for which topics would be a little bit more at home in a language institute and those which might be more for a university setting. There's an overlap, but a cluster view can help us get the difference. So I'm going to give 2 sets of topics, and when I'm giving the topics, think about which of those, which set would be for a language institute and which one might be a little bit more at home in the university classroom. Topic set number 1, things like famous inventors, popular music, the space race, the history of dogs as human companions, the science of shopping, design of buildings, portrait of an archaeologist, making first impressions. In business environments, history of aviation, why does food taste good, famous business people, technology, why do people like extreme sports, CSI crime investigations, birth order, ecotourism, medical innovations, and Martin Luther King and civil rights. What about those? What do you think about those? Are those probably Language Institute or university topics? Okay, let's look at the next set. Martin Luther King Jr. is belittled, vilified, or ignored by corporate-funded media for opposing the Vietnam War. Freedom of the press in a media landscape dominated by corporations, dark money and political outcomes, war crimes investigations of 21st century U.S. presidents, internet search engine censorship of content that angers corporate donors, persecution of corporate and government whistleblowers, large commercial media intentionally not covering stories that jeopardize corporate funding, why corporate-funded media reports almost exclusively on blue-collar crime rather than white-collar crime, corporate-funded media focusing almost exclusively on retail terrorism like Al-Qaeda and not on state terrorism such as the 2 U.S. invasions of Iraq. Well, it becomes pretty clear here that group number 1, that's for language institutes. Those are sort of like ho-hum activities that don't really require very much discussion and debate. And group number 2, those are ones that require quite a bit more debate there. And those are a little bit more controversial and hot button, and those are for the university classroom. There is overlap. Rag and Ribs are mostly the Language Institute type. All right, now that we have some topics that would be more at home in the university classroom, let's talk about what to do with Dictogloss in a university classroom. So first you select the topics, and then you can go on to do Dictogloss in the university classroom. So a general format for implementing Dictogloss in a university classroom. First, do a Dictogloss activity as following the steps that were mentioned before. Then, after the students have reconstructed the text that is the Dictogloss activity, then in the university classroom you can add more writing and speaking practice. So here's an example of phases that a Dictogloss activity might go through in a university classroom. First, preparation. For example, before you give learners a text, they could just express an opinion about a general idea. For example, if you're going to read a text about renewable energy, students might think of one kind of renewable energy and list some of its benefits and limitations. This is a preparation phase. This gets students in the mode of thinking about the topic. Next, you give the actual listening passage, and here the listening passage is a specific claim related to the topic. For example, somebody advocating renewable energy says that the reason that we are not moving towards renewable energy quickly enough is political, not technological. Then the students do the Dictogloss, they reconstruct the activity with their classmates, and then you add that that writing and speaking practice that I mentioned before. So first of all, they respond to the text with a paragraph, either agreeing or disagreeing with the ideas in the text. Then is the speaking practice element of the lesson, where here learners come together and they discuss their ideas with classmates. This is something that is according to the communicative approach. So that was an idea of actually how to do a dictogloss activity in the classroom. Here's a little bit of the research here. And if you want to see more, just see the paper accompanying this presentation to be published in the journal. Oh, dictogloss, it has traditional dictation's benefits of focusing learners' attention on language points. It does this by having them actually notice some individual points about the language. It also has them distinguish sounds in a language like L and R, B and V, etc. And when they're listening, it gives them practice putting those sounds into writing, and of course it aids in comprehension. And again, dictogloss has modernized dictation, so it has brought it into the area of communicative language learning and teaching by adding the element of actual, authentic, real-world communication. Now, the additional topics that Rajanrib and others were generally for language institutes instead of university classrooms. The topics I suggested here are geared more towards the university environment, and that makes Dictogloss available as a valuable tool for university EFL educators as well. And I have also outlined how to implement Dictogloss in a university classroom. Thank you very much, and I hope that has been helpful.